I spent years letting them believe I was fragile because it kept the peace. My husband laughed when his friends mocked me, and I stayed silent when his hand struck my face. What none of them knew was that I had once trained my body to be a weapon and my mind to be still. That night, I did not lose control. I chose it. And in choosing it, I changed everything they thought they knew about power. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I have always been described as quiet, not shy exactly, just reserved, the kind of woman people forget is in the room until they need someone to pour the tea or clear the plates. I learned early that being unnoticed can feel like safety. When I married Daniel, I believed that quiet would be enough to build a peaceful life. He was charming when we met, confident in a way that felt reassuring. He spoke for both of us, ordered for both of us, decided for both of us. At first, I mistook that for care. Our apartment was modest but clean. I kept it that way because order calmed me. Daniel liked to invite his colleagues and friends over on weekends, men who filled the room with loud voices and sharper laughter. They drank too much and talked over one another, measuring their worth in promotions and cars. I learned how to disappear into the kitchen, listening without being seen. Sometimes I caught pieces of their conversations that made my chest tighten, jokes about women, about wives who didn't know their place. Daniel would laugh the loudest. Then he would glance toward the kitchen to make sure I heard. At home, when the door closed behind the last guest, he changed. Not dramatically. There were no sudden explosions, no broken furniture. It was subtler than that. A comment about my cooking being bland. A reminder that I didn't earn as much as he did. A look that told me I had disappointed him without ever knowing how. I told myself this was marriage, that compromise meant swallowing small hurts. Silence, I believed, was maturity. What Daniel never asked about was my life before him. I offered only fragments. I said I grew up moving often, that my parents valued discipline. I never mentioned the long mornings before sunrise, the cold floors of training halls, the smell of incense and sweat. I never told him about the bruises I wore with pride, or the way my teacher's voice could still my breathing with a single word. That life felt like another person's memory. I had walked away from it because I wanted gentleness. I wanted a life where my body did not always anticipate harm. When Daniel's friends were around, I felt myself shrinking further. They called me the quiet one, sometimes right in front of me. One of them once asked Daniel if I ever talked. Daniel laughed and said, "Only when she needs something." I smiled because it was easier than explaining that my silence was a choice, not an absence. The night everything changed began like so many others. Daniel had invited his friends over without telling me. I came home from work to find the living room already crowded, empty bottles on the table. I went straight to the kitchen, my familiar refuge. I could feel the air vibrating with their voices, the way it does when tension hides behind jokes. I focused on the simple tasks, cutting vegetables, boiling water, letting the rhythm keep me steady. At some point, one of them called out to me. He asked why the food wasn't ready yet. I answered softly that it would be soon. Another laughed and said something about training wives better. Daniel didn't stop them. He leaned back in his chair, watching me like I was part of the entertainment. Something in his eyes that night was different, harder, like he wanted to prove something. When I brought the dishes out, my hands were steady. I placed the plates down carefully, avoiding eye contact. A comment flew past me about my posture, about how I walked like I was afraid to take up space. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I breathed through it the way I had been trained long ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Control first, emotion later. Then Daniel stood up. He took a step toward me and said loudly that I was embarrassing him. He told me to stand up straight, to look at people when they spoke to me. His friends fell quiet, sensing something was about to happen. I looked at him then, not defiantly, just calmly. That seemed to anger him more than tears ever could have. He slapped me. The sound was sharp, final. The room went still for a fraction of a second before someone laughed, unsure if they should. My face burned, not just from the pain, but from the certainty that something inside me had shifted. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I tasted blood and thought with surprising clarity that this was the line I had promised myself I would never let anyone cross again. Daniel's voice echoed in my ears as if from far away. He said something about teaching me respect. His friends avoided my eyes. In that moment, I felt an old stillness settle over me, the kind that comes before movement. I realized that the life I had buried was not gone. It had been waiting, patient and watchful, like a blade kept sheathed. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and looked at my reflection. There was a red mark blooming across my cheek. I pressed my fingers to it gently, assessing, the way I used to after a hard sparring session. My breathing slowed. My mind cleared. I was no longer afraid of what would happen next. I was afraid of what would happen if I continued to do nothing. When I returned to the living room, the men were talking again, pretending nothing had happened. Daniel did not apologize. He did not even look at me. He assumed, as he always had, that silence meant submission. He did not understand that silence can also mean decision. I stood there, in the center of the room, and for the first time since I married him, I let myself take up space. I did not raise my hands. I did not threaten. I simply spoke, my voice low and even, and told them that it was time for them to leave. They stared at me, startled by the sound of authority they had never bothered to listen for. Daniel laughed and told me to stop embarrassing myself. I remember thinking almost kindly that he truly had no idea who he had married. That ignorance was about to cost him more than his pride. Daniel's laughter lingered in the room, thin and sharp like glass rubbed together. His friends watched me the way people watch a fire from a distance, unsure whether to step closer or back away. I stood there quietly, my hands relaxed at my sides, my spine straight, not out of defiance, but alignment. It felt familiar, grounding, as if my body remembered something my life had tried to forget. I repeated myself, calmly, telling them it was time to leave. My voice did not shake. That alone unsettled them. One of the men muttered that maybe they should go. Daniel shot him a look, then turned back to me. He told me I was making a scene. He told me to apologize. In that moment, I saw the truth with painful clarity. He needed witnesses. He needed an audience for his power. Without them, he was just a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. I took a step closer, closing the distance deliberately, not aggressively. My eyes stayed on his, steady and unblinking. I told him that no one would ever put their hands on me again. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. One of his friends shifted in his seat. Another stood up halfway, then sat back down, uncertain. They were beginning to sense that the balance had changed, even if they didn't yet understand how. Daniel scoffed and reached for my arm. It was instinctive for him, thoughtless. The moment his fingers closed around my wrist, something ancient and precise moved through me. I did not strike. I did not lash out. I rotated my arm just enough, stepping into his space using his own momentum. My grip found a pressure point he did not know existed. He gasped, more surprised than hurt, as his knees buckled and he was forced to release me. The room erupted in startled noise. Chairs scraped. Someone swore. I stepped back immediately, my hands open again, my expression unchanged. Daniel stared at me from the floor, his face flushed, confusion replacing arrogance. I could see the truth forming in his eyes, the one he was too proud to ask. "Who are you?" I told his friends again that it was time to leave. This time, my words landed differently. One by one, they gathered their things, avoiding both our gazes. No one laughed, no one spoke. When the door finally closed behind the last of them, the apartment felt cavernous, echoing with the collapse of something we had both pretended was solid. Daniel got to his feet slowly. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as a wife or an accessory, but as a threat to the version of himself he clung to. He demanded to know what that was, what I had done. I told him the truth, or at least the part of it he had earned. I told him I had trained for many years, long before I met him. I told him I had walked away from that life because I believed peace was possible without proving strength. He laughed again, weaker this time, and said I was bluffing. I did not argue. I went into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, not to retreat, but to gather what I needed. I packed a bag with the same careful efficiency I used to prepare for long training trips. Clothes folded, documents secured, movements economical. My hands did not tremble. When I came back out, Daniel was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked small, diminished by the absence of his audience. He asked me where I thought I was going. I told him I was leaving. Not for the night, not to cool off, leaving. The words settled between us like a verdict. He tried to bargain then. He said he hadn't meant it. He blamed the alcohol, his friends, stress at work. He told me I was overreacting. I listened without interrupting, the way I had listened for years. When he finished, I told him that consequences were not negotiable, that respect was not something you ask for after you lose it. I walked out of that apartment with my bag over my shoulder and my head held level. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows, but I felt lighter with each step. I stayed with a colleague that night, someone who had always been kind without needing anything in return. I did not tell her everything. I did not need to. Sleep came easily, deep and dreamless, the kind I had not known in years. The days that followed were a quiet reckoning. Daniel called, texted, left messages that shifted from anger to pleading to silence. I did not respond. I filed a report, not because I believed it would fix everything, but because truth deserves to be documented. I contacted a lawyer. Each action felt like placing a stone, building something solid where there had only been endurance before. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the story would spread. Daniel's friends talked, they always did, but the version that traveled was not the one he would have chosen. It was fragmented, inconsistent, full of uncomfortable gaps. They spoke of the night when something went wrong, of the wife who was supposed to be weak. They spoke of fear without naming it. People at his work began to look at him differently. Invitations stopped coming. Laughter grew strained. I returned to the training hall a week later. It smelled exactly as it always had, wood and incense and time. My teacher was older now, his hair silver, his posture still perfect. He looked at me and nodded as if no years had passed at all. We did not speak much. We did not need to. I bowed and he bowed. My body remembered the forms, the discipline, the stillness beneath movement. Each session was not about violence, but reclamation. I learned then that strength is not something you turn on in anger. It is something you carry quietly until the moment demands truth. I had not punished Daniel with my skills. I had exposed him to himself. The loss of reputation, the isolation, the knowledge that the woman he dismissed had outgrown him entirely, those were the consequences he could not escape. Months later, when the divorce was finalized, Daniel tried one last time to speak to me. He asked if things could have been different. I told him they had been different every day he chose control over care. I wished him nothing, not forgiveness, not harm, just nothing. Indifference, I had learned, is its own kind of power. Today, my life is quieter, but not small. I speak when I choose. I move through the world with awareness, not fear. I no longer hide the parts of myself that once felt dangerous. They are not weapons, they are boundaries. And I have learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-respect. In the weeks after I left, I discovered how loud silence can be when it belongs to you instead of being forced upon you. The small apartment I rented felt almost empty at first. There were no raised voices bleeding through the walls, no footsteps I had to interpret for mood before I entered a room. I slept on a mattress on the floor and ate simple meals, but every breath felt earned. For the first time in a long while, I woke up without rehearsing my day around someone else's temper. Returning to training became a ritual rather than an escape. I went early in the mornings before the city fully stirred. The hall was quiet then, the kind of quiet that hums with intention. As I moved through familiar forms, I paid attention to the subtle dialogue between balance and force, restraint and release. My teacher rarely corrected me. When he did, it was with a single word or gesture. Control, he reminded me, was not about domination, but clarity. At work, changes unfolded more slowly. Word reached me in fragments, carried by sympathetic glances and hesitant questions. Daniel had taken leave, citing stress. Someone mentioned an incident, vague and uncomfortable. I did not correct them. I had learned that truth does not need help traveling. It finds its own paths. What mattered more was how I carried myself now. Colleagues who once spoke over me began to listen, not because I demanded it, but because I no longer made myself small to accommodate their noise. One afternoon, a younger coworker asked me how I stayed so calm. She said she admired it, that she wished she could be like that with her own partner. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to protect her from hard knowledge. Instead, I told her that calm is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I told her to pay attention to how she feels in silence. She nodded, thoughtful, and I hoped she would hear the warning hidden in my words. Daniel's attempts to reach me tapered off, but his presence lingered in other ways. Mutual acquaintances stopped inviting me to gatherings, unsure where loyalties lay. I did not blame them. Choosing sides is uncomfortable. What surprised me was how little I missed those rooms. Without the need to perform or endure, I found myself drawn to simpler connections, long walks, conversations that unfolded slowly, evenings where nothing happened and that was enough. There was one encounter months later that tested the steadiness I had worked to build. I ran into Daniel by chance outside a cafe. He looked thinner, his confidence fray around the edges. For a moment we stood there, two people with a shared past and no script for the present. He tried to smile. It did not reach his eyes. He asked how I was. The question felt heavy, as if he expected my answer to absolve him or condemn him. I told him I was well. He hesitated, then said he still didn't understand how he had misjudged me so completely. I considered my response carefully. I told him that he had seen what he needed to see to feel powerful. The rest had never interested him. He nodded slowly, as if that explanation hurt more than any accusation. We parted without ceremony. As I walked away, I felt no triumph, no anger, only a quiet certainty that the chapter was closed. The training hall became not just a place of practice, but of teaching. My teacher asked me one morning if I would take on a small group of beginners. They were women mostly, some older, some younger, each carrying their own reasons for being there. I agreed. Guiding them through basic stances and movements, I watched their shoulders relax, their eyes sharpen. I emphasized awareness, breath, choice. Strength, I told them, begins long before contact. One woman stayed behind after class one day. She thanked me for not making it about aggression. She said she had left a difficult marriage and was afraid of becoming hardened. I told her that discipline and softness are not opposites. They inform each other. You can protect yourself without becoming what harmed you. As the seasons changed, I noticed how my body responded differently to the world. I walked with an ease that drew fewer challenges. Predators, I had learned long ago, look for hesitation. Confidence is often enough to send them elsewhere. That knowledge brought comfort, not vigilance. I did not expect danger around every corner. I trusted myself to meet it if it came. The legal process concluded quietly. Papers signed, assets divided, no dramatic courtroom scenes, no speeches, just an ending acknowledged. When it was done, I took a day off work and went to the coast. I stood by the water, watching waves break and recede, relentless and patient. Power does not rush, I thought. It persists. Looking back now, I understand that the night Daniel struck me was not the moment I changed. It was the moment I stopped delaying change. I had always known who I was capable of being. I had simply chosen comfort over truth, peace over dignity. That choice cost me years. Reclaiming myself cost far less, even with the pain it required. People sometimes ask why I stayed as long as I did. The question is rarely cruel, just curious. I tell them that endurance can feel like virtue when you are taught that love requires sacrifice. I tell them that leaving is not failure, it is alignment. When your life no longer fits the shape you are forcing it into, something will break. Better the mold than the person inside it. Now my days are unremarkable in the best way. I work, I train, I teach, I rest. I speak my mind without apology. The skills I once hid are integrated into who I am, not as secrets, but as foundations. I am no longer interested in proving anything. I am interested in living honestly. If there is a lesson in my story, it is not that violence solves injustice. It is that self-knowledge changes the terms of every interaction. When you know your own strength, you do not need to advertise it. You do not need witnesses. You act when necessary and you walk away when it is done. I carried silence for many years as a shield. Now I carry it as a choice. And in that choice, I have found a freedom deeper than any strike I ever learned.
Time has a way of testing whether change is real or just reaction. In the months that followed my return to myself, I waited for the aftershocks, the moments when fear resurfaces, when doubt tries to reclaim ground. They came, quietly, usually at night, when memory loosens its grip and old habits whisper that safety lies in shrinking. I learned not to fight those moments. I observed them, breathed through them, and let them pass. Control, I reminded myself, is not resistance, it is awareness. Teaching at the hall became more structured. My teacher trusted me with responsibility I had not expected so soon. He said nothing about my past or my marriage. He did not need to. He watched how I moved among the students, how I corrected without humiliating, how I insisted on discipline without fear. Authority, he once told me, is earned through consistency. I carried that lesson into every class. One evening, after a long session, I sat alone on the polished floor, stretching as the hall emptied. I realized that for the first time in years, my body felt entirely my own, not something to be judged, not something to be managed for someone else's comfort, just mine. The realization brought a quiet grief for the years I had surrendered that ownership without realizing it. Grief, I learned, can coexist with gratitude. You mourn what was lost while honoring what was reclaimed. Daniel's name surfaced less often now. When it did, it was usually in the past tense, spoken with caution, as if he were a lesson rather than a person. I heard through a former neighbor that he had moved apartments, changed jobs. Reinvention, it seemed, was his way of coping. I did not wish him ill. I simply no longer felt connected to the outcomes of his choices. At work, I was offered a leadership role on a new project. It surprised some people. It surprised me, too. Not because I doubted my capability, but because I had never sought visibility before. In meetings, I spoke clearly and concisely. I did not soften my opinions to make them more palatable. The shift was noticed. One colleague remarked that I seemed different, more assured. I told her I had always been this way. I had just stopped apologizing for it. There were moments of discomfort, particularly with men who were accustomed to dominance without challenge. They tested boundaries with jokes, with interruptions. I addressed each instance calmly, directly. The discomfort passed quickly. Respect, I found, often follows the first refusal to accept less. Outside of work and training, my life grew fuller in unexpected ways. I reconnected with an old friend who had drifted away during my marriage. We spoke honestly about how isolation creeps in unnoticed. She told me she had worried about me but didn't know how to reach me. I apologized for the distance. Rebuilding trust, even with those who care for you, takes intention. One weekend, she invited me to a small gathering. I hesitated before accepting, old instincts warning me of crowded rooms and sharp laughter. When I arrived, the atmosphere was gentle, unforced. Conversations flowed without competition. No one demanded performance. I realized then how much energy I had spent bracing myself in the past. Relaxation felt like a skill I was still learning. During that gathering, someone asked me about my training, not in a mocking way, but with genuine curiosity. I spoke openly, without embellishment or secrecy. I did not frame it as something extraordinary. It was simply a part of my life. Their interest did not inflate me, it grounded me. This, too, was progress. There was a night, almost a year after I left, when I dreamed of the slap again. The sound echoed, but the fear was gone. In the dream, I turned toward it, not away. When I woke, my heart was steady. I understood then that healing is not erasure, it is integration. The memory no longer controlled me, it informed me. At the hall, one of my students faced a confrontation outside of class. She came to me shaken, asking what she should have done next. I listened carefully. I did not tell her what to do next time. Instead, I asked how she felt in that moment. She said she froze. I nodded. Freezing, I explained, is not failure, it is information. From there, we worked on grounding techniques, on recognizing early signals. Empowerment begins with understanding your own responses. As I guided others, I refined my own philosophy. Violence was never the goal, clarity was. The ability to choose rather than react. The confidence to walk away without doubt. These were lessons I had learned the hard way, but they did not need to be painful for everyone. I began to write again, something I had abandoned years earlier, not for publication, just for myself. I wrote about discipline, about silence, about the subtle ways power shifts when you stop seeking approval. Writing became another form of practice, a way to articulate truths that movement alone could not capture. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted not leaving sooner. The question carried an assumption that awareness arrives fully formed. I answered honestly. I said regret implies a choice made with full knowledge. I had acted with the tools I had then. What mattered was that I did not cling to a past version of myself out of loyalty to pain. One afternoon, as I left the hall, I noticed a young couple arguing outside. The woman's posture was defensive, her voice low. The man leaned in too close. I did not intervene physically. I did not need to. I stood nearby, visible, present. The man noticed me, hesitated, stepped back. Sometimes presence is enough. Awareness radiates outward. As I walked home, I reflected on how easily strength is misinterpreted. People assume it is loud, aggressive, unmistakable. In truth, it often appears ordinary. It looks like boundaries maintained without explanation. It looks like walking away without drama. It looks like a woman who knows herself and no longer negotiates her worth. My life did not become extraordinary after that night. It became aligned. There is a difference. Alignment does not promise constant happiness. It promises coherence. When your actions reflect your values, even difficulty feels honest. I do not tell my story to inspire fear or vengeance. I tell it because silence thrives in isolation, because too many people believe endurance is their only option, because power does not always announce itself until it is needed, and by then it must be trusted. I trusted myself that night, not to harm, but to choose. That trust has shaped every day since, and it is a trust I will never again surrender.
There is a moment after the noise has faded and the changes have settled when you realize the world is no longer watching you for permission to continue. That realization came to me quietly on an ordinary afternoon as I stood in line at a grocery store. A man behind me was impatient, sighing loudly, shifting his weight. Months ago, I would have felt compelled to apologize for existing in his space. That day, I simply stood where I was, unbothered. When I noticed the difference, it almost made me smile. Strength, I had learned, does not always announce itself with confrontation. Sometimes it reveals itself in what no longer disturbs you. The training hall continued to evolve as well. My teacher began stepping back, allowing me to shape the curriculum more fully. I incorporated discussions alongside physical practice, moments where we sat on the floor and talked about boundaries, fear, and choice. Some of the students were surprised at first. They had expected to learn how to strike harder, move faster. What they learned instead was how to listen to their bodies, how to recognize tension before it hardened into panic. One evening after class, a student stayed behind. She was younger than me, her hands still trembling slightly from exertion. She told me she had grown up watching her mother accept cruelty as normal. She asked me how I knew when enough was enough. The question settled heavily between us. I told her that the body often knows before the mind allows it. I told her to pay attention to the moments when she felt herself shrinking, when silence felt like self-erasure instead of peace. Enough, I said, is when staying costs you your sense of self. As I spoke, I realized I was answering a version of myself from years ago. The honesty of it surprised me. Teaching had become a mirror, reflecting not just what I offered others, but what I had learned through loss. Outside the hall, my life grew steadily richer in ways I had not anticipated. I traveled alone for the first time since my marriage ended. Nothing extravagant, just a small town, long walks, unfamiliar streets. Moving through the world on my own terms felt like a quiet rebellion against the life I had once accepted. I ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, changed plans without explanation. Autonomy, I discovered, is deeply nourishing. On one of those trips, I found myself watching a street performance. The crowd laughed easily, unguarded. I stood at the edge, content to observe. A woman nearby struck up a conversation, commenting on the performer's timing. We talked for a while, effortlessly. When she asked what I did, I told her simply that I taught. I did not specify what. The truth did not need embellishment. Returning home, I noticed how the city itself felt different, or perhaps it was me. Places that once felt intimidating now seemed neutral. I no longer scanned rooms for approval or danger. My awareness was relaxed, expansive. That ease did not come from assuming safety everywhere, but from trusting my ability to respond if safety was threatened. There was one unexpected message that tested that trust. It came from Daniel's sister. We had never been close, but her note was careful, respectful. She said she wanted to understand what had happened. She said she was sorry if that mattered. I took my time before responding. I did not owe her an explanation, but I sensed sincerity rather than curiosity. When we met, it was in a quiet cafe, neutral ground. She looked nervous, hands folded tightly. She told me she had watched Daniel struggle, that she was beginning to question patterns she had ignored in her own family. I listened. I did not defend myself or accuse him. I spoke only of my experience, of the moment when silence stopped being protection and became harm. She nodded slowly, eyes glossy. She thanked me,
not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Walking away from that meeting, I felt lighter. Speaking truth without expectation had become another marker of growth. I no longer needed validation. I needed alignment. At work, my project concluded successfully. Recognition followed, not loudly, but meaningfully. My name appeared on reports, my input cited. I accepted the acknowledgement without shrinking from it. Visibility no longer felt dangerous. It felt accurate. Still, there were days when old habits tried to resurface. A raised voice in a hallway would make my shoulders tense. An offhand joke would spark irritation. In those moments, I returned to breath, to posture, to presence. Recovery was quicker now. The nervous system, like any muscle, responds to consistent training. I began mentoring outside the hall as well, volunteering with a local program for women rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. I did not share my full story. I did not need to. What mattered was the environment we created, one where strength was defined as agency, not aggression, where survival was acknowledged but not romanticized. One woman in the program told me she felt ashamed for not fighting back sooner. I told her that survival often requires adaptation, not confrontation. I told her that leaving safely is an act of courage, even if it looks quiet from the outside. Shame, I said, belongs to those who harm, not those who endure. As I spoke, I recognized how deeply that belief had taken root in me. It was no longer an idea I repeated. It was something I lived. On the anniversary of the night I left, I did not mark the date deliberately. I realized it had passed only when I noticed how unremarkable the day had been. No heaviness, no vigilance, just a normal rhythm of work, practice, rest. That, more than anything, felt like victory. People sometimes expect a story like mine to culminate in a dramatic triumph, a final confrontation, a declaration of power. The truth is quieter. Power, real power, integrates into your life until it no longer needs a spotlight. It becomes the way you choose, the way you speak, the way you leave when something no longer serves you. I do not regret the years I spent silent. They taught me patience, perception, restraint. But I do not glorify them either. They were a season, not a destiny. The mistake would have been staying once the lesson was learned. Now, when I move through the world, I do so with an awareness that feels both gentle and unyielding. I am not waiting to be tested. I am not searching for conflict. I am simply present, grounded in the knowledge of who I am and what I will not accept. That knowledge has become my most reliable defense and my greatest freedom. As time went on, I noticed that my sense of urgency had softened. I no longer felt like I was outrunning my past or proving my recovery. Life settled into a steady rhythm, and within that rhythm, I found a deeper understanding of what safety truly meant. Safety was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of choice. Knowing that I could leave any situation, speak when needed, or remain silent without losing myself, that knowledge shaped everything. One morning at the hall, my teacher announced his intention to retire. The words landed gently but firmly, like a stone placed in still water. He did not ask me outright to take his place. He simply said that the hall would need someone who understood both discipline and compassion. The implication was clear. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. I spent days considering the offer without naming it. Leadership, I knew, is not about control. It is about stewardship. I thought about the women who had walked into that space carrying fear, anger, grief. I thought about my younger self bowing on cold floors, desperate to be strong enough to survive. I realized then that accepting this role was not about ambition. It was about continuity.
When I agreed, my teacher smiled in a way I had rarely seen. He told me that teaching is the final form of mastery, not because it places you above others, but because it requires humility. You must meet people where they are, not where you wish them to be. That lesson stayed with me. Taking on the hall meant long days and quiet nights, administrative tasks I had never considered, conversations about funding, schedules, outreach. I approached them with the same discipline I brought to training: attention, patience, precision. The hall slowly transformed into a place not just of physical practice, but of community. I made it a point to keep the doors open to those who could not afford traditional fees. Strength should not be a luxury, I believed. The first time a woman thanked me for making the space accessible, her voice trembling with relief, I understood that this work mattered in ways far beyond technique. There were challenges, of course. Not everyone welcomed a woman in leadership, especially one who refused to perform authority loudly. A few questioned my methods, my calm, my insistence on restraint. I addressed criticism directly, without defensiveness. Results, I knew, would speak more convincingly than arguments. At home, my evenings were peaceful. I cooked simple meals, read, wrote. Sometimes I sat in silence, not as an absence, but as a presence. Silence had changed its meaning for me. It was no longer a shield or a burden. It was a space I chose to inhabit. Occasionally, memories surfaced unexpectedly: a sound, a phrase, a particular look. When they did, I acknowledged them without judgment. Trauma, I had learned, does not vanish. It integrates when given attention without fear. I no longer braced myself against it. I allowed it to pass through, leaving less residue each time. One evening, after a late class, a young man approached me hesitantly. He said he had grown up watching his father dominate his mother and was afraid of becoming the same. He asked if discipline could change that. I told him that awareness is the beginning of change, but choice sustains it. Strength, I said, is the ability to interrupt patterns, not repeat them with more force. He listened carefully, nodding. I hoped he would carry that message forward. The reach of the hall expanded gradually. We hosted workshops on self-awareness, on conflict de-escalation, on recognizing early signs of harm. These were not glamorous topics, they were necessary ones. Attendance grew not because of spectacle, but because people felt seen. I received a letter one day from a former student who had moved away. She wrote that she had left an abusive relationship safely, crediting the confidence she built in class. I held that letter for a long time. It reminded me that impact is often invisible until it arrives quietly, folded into an envelope, carrying a truth you did not know you needed. As my role solidified, I reflected often on the woman I had been during my marriage. I did not judge her. I understood her. She had sought peace in the only way she knew how. What she lacked was not strength, but permission. Permission to prioritize herself, permission to leave, permission to believe that dignity was non-negotiable. That permission, I realized, is something many people never receive explicitly. They must grant it to themselves. My story, shared selectively, became a way to model that possibility without prescribing it. I was careful not to frame my past as a warning alone. Fear motivates briefly, understanding endures. I spoke instead about alignment, about listening to discomfort, about honoring intuition. I emphasized that leaving does not require heroics, it requires honesty. There were moments of joy that surprised me in their simplicity. laughter during class when someone finally mastered a difficult movement, shared tea after training, watching students support one another without prompting. These moments stitched together a sense of belonging I had not realized I was missing. I also began to consider the future differently, not in terms of escape or survival, but growth. What did I want to build? Who did I want to support? The questions felt expansive rather than urgent. In a quiet evening, I revisited my journals from years earlier. The handwriting was tighter, the tone cautious. I read passages where I minimized my own pain, justified what should never have been justified. Instead of shame, I felt compassion. Growth had rewritten the narrative, not erased it. I closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf. The past had its place. It no longer dictated the present. When people ask now what changed me, I do not point to the slap or the confrontation or even my training. I say that I learned to trust myself. That trust transformed every decision that followed. I am not invincible. I am not untouchable. I am human with limits and vulnerabilities, but I am no longer available for harm disguised as love or control disguised as care. That boundary is not loud. It does not need to be. It stands, quietly and firmly, shaping a life that finally feels like my own.
As the hall settled into its new rhythm under my guidance, I began to notice something subtle but profound shifting in myself. I no longer measured my days by how much I endured or accomplished. I measured them by how aligned I felt when I went to sleep at night. That metric, simple as it was, became my compass. There were mornings when the weight of responsibility pressed in unexpectedly. Running the hall meant making decisions that affected other people's safety, confidence, and growth. I felt the gravity of that often. But instead of shrinking from it, I learned to meet it with preparation and honesty. When I didn't know something, I said so. When I made a mistake, I corrected it openly. Transparency, I found, builds trust faster than perfection ever could. One afternoon, a former student returned after a long absence. She had trained briefly years earlier, left suddenly, and now stood in the doorway with hesitant eyes. After class, she told me she had left an abusive partner and disappeared to protect herself. Coming back, she said, felt like reclaiming a part of her identity she had buried. I welcomed her without questions. People deserve space to return without explanation. Her presence stirred memories of my own departure, the quiet packing, the controlled breathing. I realized how many of us leave pieces of ourselves scattered along the way, not lost, just waiting. Creating a place where those pieces could be gathered felt like a continuation of my own healing. Outside the hall, my personal relationships continued to evolve. I was more discerning now, not guarded, but intentional. I paid attention to how people responded to my boundaries. Those who respected them stayed. Those who didn't drifted away. The process felt natural, almost effortless compared to the constant negotiation I once performed. I began dating again, slowly, without expectation. I was honest about what I valued and what I would not tolerate. The conversations were different this time. I listened as much to what was unsaid as to what was spoken. When something didn't feel right, I trusted that instinct without needing to justify it. Freedom, I realized, includes the freedom to say no early. There was one person I spent time with who admired my strength openly. At first, the attention unsettled me. I had grown accustomed to invisibility, but admiration without entitlement felt different. It did not ask me to diminish myself. It did not seek to own my confidence. When the relationship eventually ended, it did so peacefully, without power struggles. That, too, was a victory. Teaching continued to deepen my understanding of power dynamics. I watched how quickly people deferred authority, how easily they gave up agency when someone else seemed confident.
I made a point of redirecting that tendency, encouraging questions, inviting dissent. Strength shared multiplies. Strength hoarded decays. We hosted a community event one weekend focused on conflict resolution, not self-defense in the physical sense, but in the relational one. Attendance exceeded expectations. People spoke about workplace intimidation, family pressure, social expectations. Listening to their stories, I was reminded that harm is rarely isolated. It thrives in systems that reward silence. As I facilitated those discussions, I was careful not to position myself as an expert on suffering. I was a guide, at most. Each person's path was their own. What I could offer was language, perspective, and the reassurance that change is possible without becoming someone you do not recognize. One evening, after everyone had left, I sat alone in the hall, lights dimmed. I thought about my teacher, now retired, and the lineage of knowledge he had entrusted to me. Carrying that forward felt like an honor and a responsibility. I understood now why he had valued restraint so deeply. Power without restraint corrodes. Restraint without power suffocates. Balance is the work of a lifetime. The outside world continued its noise, its conflicts, its injustices. I did not retreat from them, but I no longer felt consumed by them either. My sphere of influence was clearer. I invested my energy where it could make a tangible difference. That focus brought peace. I received an invitation to speak at a small conference on women's empowerment. The idea of standing on a stage once would have terrified me. Now it felt simply purposeful. I accepted, on the condition that the talk remain grounded, practical, no slogans, no dramatization. When I spoke, I told my story in broad strokes, focusing not on the violence, but on the decision. I emphasized that strength is often misinterpreted as aggression, especially in women. I spoke about discipline, about listening to the body, about the courage it takes to disappoint others in order to honor yourself. The audience listened quietly. Afterwards, several people approached me, eyes bright, thanking me for articulating what they had felt but could not name. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I felt a familiar stillness, not the tense stillness of waiting for impact, but the grounded stillness of completion. Sharing my story had not reopened wounds, it had sealed them more fully. As months passed, I noticed how rarely Daniel crossed my mind. When he did, it was without charge. He had become a reference point, not a presence. That distance was not something I had forced, it had grown naturally as my life filled with purpose. I continued to write, refining my thoughts, exploring themes of autonomy and choice. Some of that writing I shared with students, with peers. Some I kept private. Not every truth needs an audience. Knowing that felt like maturity. On the anniversary of the hall's reopening under my leadership, we held a small celebration. There was laughter, shared food, stories exchanged. Watching the community interact, I felt a quiet pride, not in myself alone, but in what collective intention can create. I ended the evening by thanking everyone for their trust. I told them that the hall existed because of mutual respect, not hierarchy, that each person there contributed to its strength. They applauded, but what mattered more was the understanding in their eyes. Walking home that night, I thought about the arc of my life, how a woman once defined by silence had become a steward of voices, not by shouting, not by force, but by choosing integrity over comfort. I do not know what challenges lie ahead. I do know that I will meet them with awareness, discipline, and self-respect. Those tools, honed over years of training and hard-earned insight, are mine to carry forward. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson I can offer. Your power is not something you acquire. It is something you uncover, layer by layer, until you recognize yourself again. There comes a stage in healing where growth is no longer driven by reaction, but by curiosity. I noticed that shift in myself during an unremarkable week when nothing dramatic happened, No confrontations, no revelations, just routine. And yet, beneath that routine, something new was forming. I was no longer defined by what I had escaped. I was being shaped by what I was choosing to build. The hall had become a second home, not because I lived there, but because it reflected my values with clarity, discipline without cruelty, strength without spectacle. When newcomers asked what kind of place it was, I told them it was a place to learn how to stand in yourself. That answer seemed to resonate more than any description of techniques or traditions. One afternoon, a woman arrived late to class, breathless and apologetic. She flinched when she spoke, as if expecting reprimand. I told her she was welcome and motioned her into the circle. Watching her slowly relax as the class progressed reminded me how deeply fear can lodge itself into posture and tone. By the end of the session, her movements were tentative but intentional. Progress does not always announce itself loudly. After class, she stayed behind and told me she had almost turned around at the door. She said she was afraid of failing, afraid of being seen. I told her that courage is rarely confident at first. It often looks like hesitation, followed by a single step forward. She nodded, eyes shining, and said she would come back. I believed her. These small exchanges accumulated into something meaningful. Each story shared, each boundary honored, reinforced the truth that strength multiplies when modeled rather than imposed. I was no longer just teaching forms, I was holding space for transformation. Outside the hall, my life continued to expand in subtle ways. I accepted invitations without the old calculation of potential discomfort. I declined others without guilt. My calendar reflected my priorities, not my obligations. That alignment brought a sense of ease I had once believed was reserved for other people. I found myself laughing more, deeply and without restraint, laughter that came from presence, not performance. It surprised me how healing joy can be when it arrives unannounced. One evening, while cleaning the hall after a long day, I found an old photograph tucked into a drawer. It was from years ago, showing a group of students and my teacher at the center. I was there too, younger, serious, eyes focused. I studied that version of myself for a long moment. She looked capable, determined. She also looked lonely. I felt a surge of tenderness for her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. I placed the photo back carefully. Honoring the past does not require living in it. A few weeks later, I was invited to collaborate with another community organization focused on youth mentorship. The idea was to introduce principles of self-regulation and awareness early, before harmful patterns calcified. I agreed, cautiously optimistic. Working with younger people requires a different kind of patience, one rooted in example rather than explanation. The first session was chaotic. Restless energy, skepticism, testing boundaries. I did not raise my voice. I did not assert authority through volume. I waited. Gradually, the room settled. Presence, I had learned, communicates more than instruction. By the end, a few of the teens asked thoughtful questions. One asked if strength meant never being afraid. I told him strength meant knowing what to do with fear when it arrives. He considered that quietly. Seeds were being planted. As my influence widened, I became more protective of my inner life, not secretive, but selective. I maintained rituals that grounded me, early morning training, journaling, moments of stillness before sleep. These were not luxuries, they were maintenance. Power, if neglected, can erode. I also became more aware of how easily people project expectations onto those they perceive as strong. Advice requests increased. Confessions arrived unprompted. I learned to listen without absorbing, to offer perspective without taking responsibility for outcomes. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. That distinction was hard-earned. There was a moment during a public Q&A after a workshop when someone asked if they believed people could truly change. The room grew quiet, waiting for a definitive answer. I paused. Then I said that change is possible when accountability meets support. Without both, patterns repeat. I added that change is not owed to anyone else. It must be chosen for oneself. That answer did not please everyone. I saw disappointment in a few faces, perhaps from those hoping for absolution without effort. I did not soften the message. Truth does not need to be palatable to be kind. Later that night, alone, I reflected on how differently I handled discomfort now. I no longer rushed to resolve it or explain myself. I let it exist. That capacity to sit with unease without collapsing or reacting felt like one of my greatest accomplishments. Occasionally, I wondered how my life might have unfolded if I had never left my training, if I had never married Daniel, if choices had diverged earlier. Those thoughts came without regret. Speculation, I realized, is not the same as longing. My path, with all its turns, had brought me here. Here felt right. I received another letter, this one from my teacher. He wrote sparingly, as always. He said he had heard of the hall's work and was proud. He reminded me to rest, to remember that leadership requires sustainability. His words felt like a benediction. I folded the letter and kept it close. As the year drew to a close, I took stock not of achievements, but of qualities. I was more patient, more honest, less reactive. I trusted my intuition and respected my limits. These were not dramatic changes, they were foundational ones. On the final class of the year, I gathered everyone together and thanked them for their commitment. I told them that progress is not linear and that setbacks do not erase growth. I encouraged them to carry what they had learned beyond the hall into their lives, their relationships, their decisions. The room was quiet, attentive. Shared intention filled the space. Walking home that night, the city lights reflecting softly on wet pavement, I felt a deep sense of continuity. The woman who had once endured in silence was not gone. She had evolved. Her silence had become discernment. Her endurance had become choice. I understood then that my story was no longer about what had been done to me. It was about what I continued to do with my life. That shift from reaction to authorship marked the truest turning point of all. And as I stepped into the coming year, grounded and aware, I carried one certainty with me. Whatever challenges awaited, I would meet them not as someone bracing for harm, but as someone standing firmly in her own authority. As another year unfolded, I began to understand that stability does not mean stagnation. It means growth without chaos. My days were full, but not frantic. Purposeful, but not rigid. I allowed myself to change my mind, to revise plans, to follow intuition, even when it led me off familiar paths. That flexibility felt like a luxury I had once believed I could not afford. The hall continued to attract people from different backgrounds, each carrying their own quiet reasons for being there. I noticed patterns in their stories, how often strength had been confused with endurance, how often silence had been mistaken for consent. These realizations did not overwhelm me. They clarified my mission, not to fix, not to rescue, but to illuminate options. One morning, a local journalist reached out, asking to write a piece about the hall's approach to empowerment. My first instinct was to decline. Visibility still carried a residue of risk in my body. But after sitting with the request, I recognized the old reflex at work, avoidance disguised as humility. I agreed, on the condition that the focus remain on the work, not my personal history. The interview was straightforward. We spoke about discipline, about creating safe spaces, about redefining strength in practical terms. When the article was published, it was measured and respectful. People recognized the philosophy, not the spectacle. That felt right. Attention came, but it did not distort the integrity of what we were building. With increased visibility came increased scrutiny. A few critics questioned whether my approach was too soft, not aggressive enough. I listened without defensiveness. There's always pressure to conform to louder narratives. I responded once, calmly, explaining that effectiveness does not require theatrics. After that, I returned my focus to the work itself. Consistency, I had learned, outlasts controversy. At home, I rearranged my living space, removing objects that no longer resonated. The process was symbolic. I was making room for what was current, not what had once been necessary. Letting go had become easier, not because attachment was gone, but because clarity had grown. I began exploring new forms of movement alongside my training, walking meditations, slow forms that emphasized flow over force. They complemented my practice, reminding me that adaptability is a form of resilience. Rigidity, even in strength, can become a vulnerability. One evening, after a particularly demanding week, I felt exhaustion settle into my bones. Instead of pushing through, I rested. I canceled plans without apology. I allowed myself to be still. That decision, simple as it was, represented a profound shift. Rest was no longer something I earned through suffering. It was something I claimed through self-respect. The following week, I facilitated a session on recognizing early warning signs in relationships, subtle indicators that often precede overt harm. The discussion was candid. People shared experiences of dismissing discomfort, rationalizing disrespect. I emphasized that intuition is not paranoia. It is information gathered quietly over time. Learning to trust it is an act of courage. After the session, a participant approached me privately. She said she had been debating whether to leave her partner and felt guilty for considering it. I told her that guilt often arises when we prioritize our well-being in systems that benefit from our silence. I did not tell her what to do. I told her she deserved safety and dignity. The decision, I reminded her, was hers alone. Moments like that reinforced my belief that empowerment is not directive, it is permissive. It grants people access to their own authority. As seasons changed, I found myself reflecting less on the past and more on continuity. What traditions would I pass on? What values would anchor the next phase of my life? I began documenting practices, philosophies, lessons learned, not as a legacy project, but as a resource. Knowledge, when shared thoughtfully, extends beyond individual lifetimes. There was a quiet pride in that work, untainted by ego. I was not trying to be remembered, I was trying to be useful. One afternoon, while reviewing those notes, I came across an early journal entry written shortly after I left my marriage. The words were careful, tentative, hopeful, but uncertain. Reading them now, I felt a wave of gratitude, not for the pain that preceded them, but for the courage they represented. Courage, I realized, often looks like taking the next step without guarantees. That evening, I attended a small gathering hosted by colleagues. The conversation turned to resilience, to how people rebuild after upheaval. I listened more than I spoke. When I did contribute, it was with clarity rather than intensity. I did not feel the need to persuade. My presence was enough. Someone asked me later how I maintained such composure. I told them that composure is not emotional absence. It is emotional literacy, knowing what you feel, why you feel it, and what to do next. That understanding had been hard-won, but it was transferable. I continued mentoring, refining my ability to support without overextending. Boundaries remained central. I modeled them consistently, trusting that example would resonate more deeply than instruction. And it did. As the year drew toward its end, I felt a quiet anticipation, not for an event, but for a sense of readiness. I was no longer reacting to life. I was engaging with it deliberately. On a crisp morning, I stood outside the hall before opening the doors, breathing in the cool air. I thought about how far I had come, not in distance, but in depth. The journey had not been linear or easy, but it had been honest. I understood now that power is not something you wield over others. It is something you cultivate within yourself, shaping how you move through the world. It informs your choices, your boundaries, your capacity for compassion. That understanding had reshaped my life in ways I could never have predicted when I was still enduring in silence. It had given me clarity, purpose, and peace. And as I unlocked the door and welcomed the day, I knew that whatever came next would be met with the same steady awareness that had carried me this far. Grounded, deliberate, and fully my own.
The hall had settled into a rhythm that mirrored my own. Days were busy, but they carried a sense of order and intention I had never known before. The students moved with focus, returning week after week, not out of obligation, but because they felt the subtle shift that comes when discipline meets respect. Watching them grow reminded me of the long path I had walked to arrive at this place, not just in skill, but in understanding what it means to stand in your own power. There were mornings when I arrived early, the city still hushed, and I would practice alone. These sessions were unhurried, meditative. I moved through forms I had known for decades, each posture a conversation with memory, with body, with breath. The familiar routines were grounding, but the awareness now ran deeper. Every motion carried intention. Every pause was deliberate. Even the quiet moments spoke. I realized how much strength is hidden in stillness, in the spaces between action. One afternoon, a new student came in, a young woman, hesitant, clutching her bag like a shield. She watched the other students with wary eyes. After a brief introduction, she began to follow the movements, tentative and unsure. I observed her closely, noting how tension had seeped into her stance, how fear had settled like a weight across her shoulders. When class ended, I invited her to sit with me. "I'm afraid I'll fail," she admitted, voice barely audible. I smiled gently. "Courage is not the absence of fear," I said. "It's moving forward despite it." I told her that each step she took, however small, was already progress. That day I watched her shoulders relax fractionally. Sometimes the smallest shifts are the most meaningful. Outside of the hall, life had become steady in a way that felt almost revolutionary. I no longer measured success in other people's approval. I no longer accommodated disrespect to keep the peace. Freedom, I had learned, was not granted. It was claimed, quietly, decisively. I discovered that living on your own terms does not require drama. It simply requires attention, intention, and consistency. Occasionally, Daniel's presence resurfaced, not physically, but in memory. A fleeting image, a phrase remembered, a ghost of tension. I acknowledged these moments without letting them dominate. I understood now that trauma does not vanish, it is integrated. The memory of him no longer dictated my choices. Instead, it underscored the importance of the boundaries I had fought so hard to maintain. A few months later, a former colleague reached out. She had heard of the hall and wanted to discuss a partnership for a women's mentorship program. We met at a small cafe. She explained that her organization aimed to provide support for women navigating difficult relationships, including abuse, financial dependence, and isolation. I listened, nodding. I knew what it meant to face such circumstances firsthand. I shared insights from the hall, not as prescriptions, but as guidance. We discussed awareness, self-respect, recognizing early warning signs, and the importance of small but consistent acts of autonomy. By the end of the conversation, we had crafted a pilot program, workshops combining physical awareness, decision-making skills, and emotional resilience. That collaboration reignited a part of me that had lain dormant, the desire to extend the lessons of discipline and choice beyond the walls of the hall, not through spectacle, but through influence and example. We implemented the program quietly, deliberately, ensuring every participant felt safe and empowered. The impact was immediate. Women who once doubted their ability to act began making intentional choices. Some left harmful relationships. Others reclaimed autonomy in subtle but meaningful ways. One evening, after leading a workshop, I sat alone in the hall reflecting. The room smelled faintly of sweat, tea, and wood polish. Sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. I thought about the years I had spent hiding my strength, pretending to be powerless. Those years had been painful, yes, but they had also prepared me for this moment. The discipline I had cultivated, the awareness I had honed, the patience I had learned, all of it had become a tool for not just survival, but for helping others stand in their own power. I realized then that true mastery is not about physical skill alone. It is about integration, aligning mind, body, and intention. It is about responding rather than reacting. It is about knowing when to act and when to step back. That clarity had been forged in the quiet aftermath of trauma through years of reflection, discipline, and patience. As the sun set, I received a message from a student who had completed the mentorship program. She wrote about leaving a relationship that had been controlling and manipulative. She described a sense of liberation she had never felt before, and she thanked me for guiding her to the awareness that made her choices possible. I held the message close. Impact, I realized, often travels quietly. It does not need applause to be real. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, reflecting on the transformation that had unfolded over the past few years. The woman I had been, the one who endured humiliation and abuse, was still a part of me, but she was no longer the person defining my present. She had evolved, layered with resilience, clarity, and an unshakable sense of self. The silence I once carried as a burden had become a deliberate tool, a shield, a teacher, a source of inner power. In the weeks that followed, the hall experienced an unexpected challenge. A new, ambitious martial arts school opened nearby, drawing attention and some students. It was tempting to feel threatened, to react defensively, but instead I observed quietly. I reminded myself that true influence does not rely on competition. My focus remained on cultivating authenticity, safety, and sustainable growth. Students who valued that approach stayed. Others were free to explore elsewhere. Maintaining integrity, I realized, is a form of resilience in itself. One day, a young woman approached me after class, her eyes brimming with tears. She had been struggling with a decision to leave her partner, fearing retaliation or judgment. I listened. I did not offer solutions. I asked what she wanted and what she could tolerate. We discussed safety plans, options, and timing. By the end of the conversation, she left with a calm determination I recognized, the same clarity I had once fought to reclaim for myself. Moments like these reinforced the deeper lesson of my journey. Power is not measured by the strength of a strike, the volume of a voice, or the ability to dominate. It is measured by the ability to act from clarity, to claim choice, and to maintain integrity even in the presence of fear. As months turned into a full year since I assumed leadership of the hall, I noticed the subtle ways my life had transformed. My body had regained a fluid confidence that went beyond martial skill. My mind had grown disciplined, not rigid, able to navigate complexity without panic. My relationships were chosen carefully, grounded in mutual respect and shared values. And my purpose, helping others find their own alignment, had become a constant North Star. Late one evening, after everyone had left the hall, I sat cross-legged on the floor, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The memory of that fateful night, the slap, the humiliation, the moment I finally refused to be powerless, felt distant yet vivid in its lessons. It was the crucible that had forced me to confront fear, reclaim autonomy, and embrace the quiet, disciplined strength that had always been within me. I understood, finally, that my story was not about vengeance or confrontation. It was about awakening, about choosing oneself, about transforming pain into insight, endurance into mastery, silence into clarity. And in that still, quiet hall, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the ability to guide others toward discovering their own power.
The final part of my story begins not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet realization. The world had changed, and so had I. Not overnight, not in a burst of sudden empowerment, but through countless small, deliberate decisions that accumulated into a life fully my own. I had reclaimed my body, my mind, my choices, and in doing so, discovered a strength that required no display, no applause, no approval. Months had passed since the last significant upheaval, yet life remained dynamic. The hall continued to thrive under my guidance, attracting students who sought more than technique. They sought alignment, clarity, and presence. Their journeys became mirrors for my own, revealing not only the universality of fear and uncertainty, but also the resilience that lives quietly within those who dare to notice it. One evening, a young woman came to me with a dilemma. She had recently left an abusive partner and was navigating a complicated family situation. Her anxiety was palpable, her posture tight, voice shaking. I listened without interruption, absorbing not only her words, but the unspoken emotions behind them. She asked if strength meant never feeling afraid. I paused before answering. Strength, I said softly, is not the absence of fear. It is what you do with it. It is the clarity to act even when your body trembles. It is the courage to choose yourself consistently. Her eyes widened, as though hearing a truth she had long suspected but could not articulate. She nodded slowly, and I saw in her the same spark I had once needed to recognize in myself. That moment reminded me of the greatest lesson I had learned. Empowerment is not something granted, it is claimed. And when claimed, it radiates outward, influencing lives quietly but profoundly. That night, I reflected on the arc of my journey, from a woman who endured humiliation and control to someone who stood firmly in her own authority. I realized that the most remarkable change was not in the physical skills I had regained or the positions I had attained, but in the internal architecture of my life. My boundaries, once tentative and reactive, had become firm and non-negotiable. My awareness, once consumed by anxiety and vigilance, had become intentional and grounded. My sense of self, once fractured by the weight of expectation, had become whole. The path had not been linear. There were moments of doubt, lingering shadows of fear, and the occasional pull to retreat into silence. But each time I reminded myself that power is not forged in moments of comfort. It is cultivated in the steady, sometimes painful practice of aligning with your values, making deliberate choices, and refusing to let fear dictate your course. As the hall's community deepened, I noticed subtle transformations in those around me. Students who once doubted their capacity to move confidently now carried themselves with awareness. Women who had questioned their worth began asserting boundaries that had previously seemed impossible. Even those who had initially resisted the principles of discipline and patience began to recognize their utility. These ripples, small and often unnoticed, became my most meaningful measure of success. Life outside the hall flourished as well. I had learned to prioritize relationships that nurtured mutual respect and growth, and to disengage gracefully from those that did not. Social gatherings were no longer arenas of stress, but opportunities to connect with intention. I approached conversations with clarity, listening as much to the spaces between words as to the words themselves. One weekend, I was invited to a women's leadership summit to share insights from my work. The invitation initially made me pause. Public speaking had seemed daunting, an exposure I was reluctant to accept. But this time, I approached it not as a test, but as an opportunity to offer practical guidance. On stage, I shared my experiences selectively, focusing on principles rather than drama. I spoke about self-awareness, resilience, boundaries, and the importance of claiming one's power quietly but deliberately. I emphasize that true strength is often misunderstood, feared, or undermined when wielded by women. Society expects compliance, silence, and accommodation, but real strength, I had learned, is quiet, disciplined, and deliberate. It manifests in choices, in boundaries, in the refusal to shrink in order to make others comfortable. And perhaps most importantly, it is sustainable. It does not exhaust, it does not burn bridges unnecessarily, and it does not demand validation. Months later, I received a letter from a former student who had taken the principles we discussed and applied them in her life. She had left an abusive situation safely, secured stable housing, and found work that allowed her to support herself. Her words conveyed gratitude, pride, and a newfound sense of agency. I held the letter close, understanding that this was the culmination of my journey in a profound sense. My experiences, my training, my endurance, all of it had become a tool for others to claim their own power. Sitting in the hall one evening, surrounded by students practicing quietly, I felt a sense of completion I had never known in my earlier life. Completion, I realized, is not the absence of challenge, it is the presence of clarity. The knowledge that regardless of what comes, you can respond with awareness, integrity, and intention. I thought back to the night everything changed, when humiliation and violence collided with the truth of who I was. That night was a crucible, a reckoning. And yet, the real transformation was not in the act itself, but in what followed, the years of patient reclamation, the cultivation of awareness, the refusal to be defined by fear. Now, standing in my own life, I recognize the true moral of my story. Empowerment is not found in vengeance, confrontation, or spectacle. It is found in alignment with yourself, your values, and your choices. It is found in consistency, in patience, in the quiet assertion of boundaries, and in the deliberate cultivation of presence. The woman I once was, the one who endured in silence, is still part of me, but she exists now as a teacher rather than a prisoner. The choices I make today honor her experience without allowing it to control me. The strength I carry is measured not by what I can destroy, but by what I can preserve: my dignity, my autonomy, my capacity to act deliberately, and my ability to guide others toward the same awareness. And so, as the hall quiets for the night and the last student leaves, I remain in the space I have built, not as a monument to suffering, but as a living testament to resilience, clarity, and quiet power. My story, once defined by endurance and reaction, is now defined by choice, awareness, and the deliberate cultivation of strength. Whatever challenges remain, whatever obstacles may arise, I know this: I am present, I am grounded, and I will act with integrity. My life is mine, fully and deliberately,
And that is the greatest victory of all.